welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I am your host and interviewer each week. 6 years, 400 episodes, the world's largest weekly leadership podcast, where Tuesdays and Fridays we curate conversations with people from all walks of life designed to make you a better leader, to make you more effective. Franklin Covey is the sponsor of this podcast, the world's most trusted leadership firm, and I'm privileged to talk with academics, researchers, CEOs, business titans, creators, artists, entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, solopreneurs, Pulitzer Prize winning, Emmy winning, Tony winning, you name it. We have interviewed some of the most influential minds in the world. Sometimes they are household names, sometimes they are best-selling authors, sometimes you may have never heard of them because they have survived or lived through some spectacular tragedy, some unspeakable setback, and they've summoned the energy and the courage, the care to teach us lessons through that. Today, our guest is the lead author of 11 books in the series known to many as the 101 Things I Learned series. He is a writer, he is a designer. You'll learn a lot about him, but I'm focusing on Matthew Frederick today because he's done something I think no one else has done. He has led the curation of this 11-book series. I'm going to guess there'll be more in it, where there is a co-author that is also a subject matter expert on 11 varied topics that I think you will find riveting today. We'll water ski across all things related to writing because so many of you, our listeners and viewers, I'll bet are writing still in some capacity. You haven't fully outsourced it to ChatGPT yet, whether you're writing blogs or LinkedIn posts or short or long form opinion columns or your authors yourself. I think you'll learn a lot from our teacher today, Matthew Frederick. Matthew, welcome to On Leadership.
Hi, Scott. Great to be here.
So I became invested in you several years ago when I found one of these books in the 11 book series, The 101 Things I Learned. And then I bought the next one and bought the next one, bought the next one. I think I'm pretty close to having the entire connection. And like I said in my opening, I think you have done something that maybe no one else has done, and that is, certainly people have written 11 books before. We have lots of authors that have written 90 books or 100 books, but you've done something remarkable in this easy to consume, fun, engaging, relevant, practical, pragmatic series where you are, although you are the lead author, at least you're the producer or creator of this series, you have paired with a subject matter expert from all different types of background, education backgrounds. We're going to delve into this conversation today, but first, Matthew, would you take a few minutes maybe and rewind a couple of decades and talk about your professional experience, your academic background, and then maybe we'll delve into what was the vision, how did this idea hatch, and how has it gone differently when you thought, you were born where, and then what happened?
I was born in Philadelphia, blue-collar family, and moved to Boston when I was 21. Some things happened in those 21 years, but moved to Boston to go to architecture school. And I am an architect today. I practice. And architecture school for me, and for, I think, the vast majority of students, there might not even be an exception, it's brutal. It is just brutal. I was an excellent student through elementary and high school. Architecture school just pulled the rug right out from under me. We weren't, everything was learning by doing. So the assignment might be to design a building on a complex site in an urban area. And I knew nothing about how cities worked. I knew very little about how buildings worked. And the discussions, but you're assigned, you have to do this. And I'm thinking, why don't you tell me how to do it, and then I'll do it. And instead, every week, you would pin your work up that you had done over the preceding week, and you'd show it to the class and the instructor, and often some visiting critics, and they would kind of tell you did everything wrong. And again, I'm thinking, why didn't you tell me up front what I needed to do? So this was very unsettling. And the critics would often contradict each other. one might say, well, you've made this very light, airy building, but this site really calls for something heavy and strong and emphatic. And you think, oh, well, I guess I just wasted my time. And then another critic says, no, this is perfect. This light building is a great counterpoint to the heavy masonry historic buildings around it. And you come out of that wondering, well, which is true, right? And if these guys are the experts, why are they disagreeing? And it's just, everything was like that. Everything I learned, I felt like the next thing I learned undid it. Um, a few years later, after graduation, I had a great opportunity to run a community college architecture program. I started the program, created the design studios. By the way, a design studio, that's the physical space in which you learn design, but it's also the name of the class you take every semester, along with regular lecture courses. And the design studio, well, architecture buildings are kind of famous on many campuses for being the only building that is lit up 24 hours, because you do live in there doing your work. So anyway, when I was teaching at the community college, there, students often with disabilities, distractions with kids, compromised schedules, in many cases are the first in their family to go to college. So the learning is already compromised by so many factors, and I'm trying to teach a very difficult subject. So I created a handout for my students at one point, and it was called like the 24 most important lessons of Architecture 101. A few years later, I was working, my now wife, who's a literary agent, she looked over my shoulder and she saw something in my stack of papers on my desk, and she saw that handout from years ago. She said, well, that's interesting. Did you ever think of making a book about that? And I said, well, I kind of did. And she said, well, you're not making any money as an architect. Why don't you try not making any money as an author? So I turned the handout with a lot more such material into 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School. And the goal was to meet the needs of that struggling student who's lost, who just needs something, anything to grab onto to feel more confident. So if it's as simple as roll your drawings with the image facing out so that when you unroll them, they sit on the table, that's a lesson. But there's obviously much more complex stuff in there too.
But what a great story, because in case anybody missed that, I think there's such phenomenal application for everyone. Something that you designed as a tool for your students serendipitously was viewed by your wife, who happens to be a literary agent. She asks a fairly innocuous question: have you ever thought of making that into a book? And you said, well, matter of fact, I have. And here you are now, 11 books later in this series with titles like The 101 Things I Learned in Advertising School, Architecture School, Culinary School, Engineering, Fashion, Film, Law, Product Design, Urban Design, and others. But you didn't try to become the subject matter expert in all of those. You decided to pair with someone who had great content, probably interpersonal connection with you, and that you could get along with. I want to talk about that because co-authoring is a very challenging interpersonal experience. There is ego, there is insight, there is stature, there's vision, alignment, or disagreement. We'll talk about that. How have you selected the subjects that you choose to include in this series known as The 101 Things I Learned?
My wife actually had the foresight to propose the series at the outset, and I didn't feel prepared for that in any way. But when the architecture book is published by MIT Press, and in that proposal, we suggested this series. And I think I kind of nodded and went along thinking, yeah, could be a great way to make money, particularly when the architecture book just sold like crazy. I thought, all right, here's a lot more books that we could sell the same way. And I've always been a jack of all trades. So let's dive into some of these other fields. Now, my wife and I will do all kinds of analysis as to what the next titles should be and why. And we study the audience, which subjects can be illustrated well, how are the students likely to respond, and so forth. And my standing joke is we tabulate that and we come up with the answer, and then the publisher tells me to do something else. And actually, for the first 4 books after architecture, that that's pretty close to what happened. The publisher at that point was Hachette, said, well, let's do business school, culinary school, fashion school, and film school, which, great, I'm interested in all of those things. So I basically spammed professors across the country and said, I need a co-author. And the interview process was basically an audition where they would put lessons on the page, and I would react to them and say, well, this isn't working, but this is, or here you've got a great lesson idea, but I think it could be 3 lessons, right? Because we're really trying to boil it down. And so the working relationship was begun in the audition, and out of which I eventually picked someone to go with.
For those who are listening to this in audio format, you should take a moment and go onto Amazon or your favorite digital bookseller and pull up the 101 Things I Learned series so you can get a sense for what these books look like. These are all in what you might call a landscape format versus a portrait format. They open left to right in terms of a linear view. They are all organized very similarly in that the left side of the page is an illustration or 2 or 3, and the right side of the page is a facing fact, a headline, and then usually a couple of paragraphs or a few sentences that moderates this left side illustration. I think it's compelling because I believe that one of an author's jobs is to calm what's known as the reptilian brain of the reader, right? What is their writing style? Is there a cadence? Is there a format that I can kind of release myself to so that I can actually get into the content? How did you decide to build that cadence across all 11 books, which I have loved, by the way? Where did that idea come to have an illustration on the left and the pithy short thought on the right? Because in many cases, these books are a start anywhere, go everywhere. You could pick up, anywhere about the book and go left to right if you wanted to. They aren't necessarily sequentially, at least from a reader's point of view. Talk to me about how you decided to design the book.
Scott, when I teach writing classes, I teach typically concept. A class I teach a lot is, what's your big or little idea? What's the thing driving the book? And I show how that can be turned into a comprehensive view of what the content of the book is, how the content is organized, graphically and physically, what the book looks like. So I look for that one idea to drive it. So that's, to me, it's a bit of an outside-in approach, right? Because typically I have an author who just has an idea and they dive in, and then they reach a point in the process where what they've created is a mess and they need help. And so I try to pull them back and look from outside in at what they've done. The interesting thing to me about the architecture title is I didn't do that. It was completely intuitive. I am an architect. I'm in that world. I taught architecture. So I just had an intuitive need of what I thought the students wanted. And I don't think at any point there was a clear exploration. What if we do it the book this way or that way or that way? It was, this is what feels right. And so I did it. And MIT Press they bought in almost right away to the idea that the book should be a landscape format. I don't know what it is that feels right about that, but it did. Maybe architectural drawings are often oriented horizontally, but it just felt right. I wanted the book to be in these the lessons to be in these clear, discrete chunks, so that the student the reader wasn't worried about what's the next thing I'm going to read that's going to undo this. Just focus on, and by the way, architecture students, they hate to read. They're visually oriented. So that was another reason for keeping it simple, make sure every lesson has a drawing. When I got to the other books, it became a very different challenge. Then I had to think very differently about how to do it.
These are maybe some nuanced questions, but I think all the writers and authors in our audience, which are vast, are going to be interested in this. How do you curate the 101 things? Does your complimentary subject matter expert submit you a list of 200 and together you pare it down? Do they submit you a list of 70 and you work to augment it to 100? 101, of course, is a catchy marketing number. Not a lot of science there other than the obvious. How do you curate the content and sequence the content?
Well, you've already said how difficult the co-authorship process is, right? And since I've created this brand, these authors who may view the world and there's topic area very differently from how I do, they have to fit what they know into this format, and that's not natural for them. Now, when I started the series, I had broken what I learned down into these little 101 chunks, and I thought that everybody could do that. I thought I just did it for architecture. Certainly other people can do it, and I'll edit and I'll tweak and I'll illustrate. I illustrate pretty much all the books. But it's something my co-authors might disagree with me, but as I see it, it's almost turned into, I talked to them for 2 years and I glean from them the little gems that maybe they don't even recognize themselves. And oh my gosh, you just said something that is perfect. That's a heading for a lesson. The students are going to love that. And a lot of it comes about through me asking, let me back up a little bit. Most of my co-authors are probably around 40 years or so old, which is a great point in your career because you're still close enough to your schooling that you remember that experience. You're not an old hand in the profession where your knowledge is congealed, calcified, or you're on that cusp. It's an exciting place. But they frequently they still don't recognize when or what the beginning point was. And I'm the ultimate beginner because I know nothing about film, making film, right, or designing fashions. So I'm always asking them, well, wait a second, that thing you just said, why is that true? Okay, yeah, you explain. Well, but why is that true? Why? And so I become that annoying 6-year-old. Why? And we eventually boil it down to something that is really clear and simple, and that I know that confused student can get, and that's what lands on the page.
Matthew, I know I'm a bit of a fanboy in your books, and that's okay because I get to pick the guests and the topics for Franklin Covey's podcast. But I think you also have tapped into, if you will, maybe the zeitgeist of a lot of readers in the world that have shorter attention spans, that have an onslaught of messaging and information coming at them. And if you don't want to go to the CIA school in New York to become a chef, you just want a cursory knowledge, your books are extraordinary for that, or for architecture or design or business. What you've done is, I think, really reader-friendly. You have captured the visual learner, if you will, by your illustrations, sketches, portraits, bar charts, graphs, you name it on the left side. And then you have curated a headline, and then you've flushed out some insight. This all seems extremely intentional for a broad variety of learner and reader. Have I given you more credit than you deserve, or is that a fair assessment of your intentionality on this?
Well, you've been overly complimentary because it's never occurred to me that I'm the only one that has done this. I don't know if that's true or not. But the process is very collaborative and very difficult. I'm thinking through the many phone conversations. We weren't Zooming back then for most of the books, right? So the many phone conversations where the phone would sit on my desk for 3 hours and we would talk. And I'm thinking now of the product design book, 101 Things I Learned at Product Design School, which I wrote with Marty Thaler and Sung Yang. And Marty and Sung have two very different approaches to product design. Marty is very detailed. He knows something about everything. And Sung has a way of making Zen-like observations. And so one lesson, for example, we were talking, I think I just bought maybe some new dress shoes. And I love Cole Haan shoes because they have a weight to them, the dress shoes. And when you walk in them, you feel authoritative. And so I was and I'd also bought a clothing iron from Walmart, but it was super heavy and it just felt great when you used it. Man, this thing can iron some clothes. And so I brought this up to them, the idea that heaviness conveys quality. And then Marty said something like, well, but an athletic shoe, you don't want to be heavy. You feel a light shoe that's well made. You think, oh my God, this thing's perfect. And then as we're mucking around, Sung simply said, a product has a right weight. That's exactly what landed on the page. So Sung he basically put that on the page. And obviously I had to edit and tweak the body, but that's exciting to me, is for everybody to discover the lesson, not to arrive with the lesson.
I think you're a pioneer because I've been in the book business a long time. I have sold or been part of teams that have sold and promoted tens of millions of books. I've authored 8 myself. Like your wife, I am a literary agent. For those of you who are watching this visually, you can see thousands of books behind me of people that we have interviewed. I think you're a pioneer in that you have created, I think, the first ever series where you are a co-author with invited subject matter experts, where you also talk about different topics, but use the same format and the same cadence. I think it's absolutely genius. You've done something also very interesting as the producer and lead author. You always list your name second, and you highlight and promote your co-author as the first author. In most cases, one author, and in rare cases, two authors. How did you manage to check your ego? Would have been hard for me to have put your name second on the page. And what was the thinking behind that, on the cover rather?
When I go back to 2008 or 9, when we did, the architecture book was out and we were doing the first 4 books outside of my expertise, I had no idea what it was to create a trademark. I didn't know what these books were going to look like. Would it say on the cover, Matt Frederick's 101 Things I Learned? That felt a little weird, but I didn't know. And maybe the first book that I began to work on with a co-author was the film book. And in interviewing potential co-authors, a lot of them were very curious about how big is my name going to be on the cover? Is my name ahead of yours? And when you think about it, that's a big deal in the film industry, right? Whose name is on the poster? Who's the highest and biggest? Are you over the movie title, under it? So I found that very interesting that my process of working this out with my co-author mimicked the way their industry worked. And I realized in talking with Neil Landau, my co-author, that it couldn't possibly make sense for my name to be first. They're the expert, and I am pulling content out of them into my format, but they are absolutely the expert. Now, over the years, I think I've written a greater and greater percentage of the book, but nothing goes into it that the co-author doesn't agree with. Well, there might be some exceptions. They might push back a little and say, oh boy, I really wish that lesson hadn't landed in there. But they have final say.
I think this is a phenomenal book club. There's 11 titles currently. We'll talk about the future. What a cool idea. If you've got 11 members of your team or more, buy one copy of all of these books, pass them out, and have a book club every day for 101 days, and have each people take a minute or two apiece and teach something they learned from one of your chapters in one of your books and apply it to their industry. I think you will exponentiate the knowledge, the mindset, the visioning, the application of your team. If I was still leading a team of that size, which I did for many decades, I would be buying 11 copies, one each of all the series, passing them out almost arbitrarily and saying, I want everyone to teach for 2 minutes. What is the concept and how does it apply? In fact, let's talk about that. Across the 11 titles, which I mentioned earlier, what are some of the key things that you learned from your lead author, if you will, that have applied in your life as a husband, as a human, as an entrepreneur, as an architect? What are some of the key learnings? I don't expect you to remember all 11 times 101, whatever number that is, don't know. What are some key learnings that stick with you, that haunt you in a positive way?
Tough question. I'm always impressed and touched when people say that they've read lessons in the architecture book and they're applying it to some other field or to their life in general. That is very rewarding. What have I learned, you're asking, from, I don't know, do you care to take another pass at the question?
Sure.
Well,
here's a good example.
It's a good one.
I'm learning something on every page, right? I happen to have in my hand 101 things I learned in product design school, right? Good ergonomics doesn't necessarily mean a perfect fit. 10% thicker is 33% stronger. Drawings simulate appearance. Mock-ups simulate experience. A playful object doesn't always have to be an object for play. Dissonance is desirable. Is there anything that you'd say, gosh, in this book, number so-and-so, and actually you don't number, you do number them, but is there anything that's been like pervasively impactful on you that's changed the way you lead, the way you draw, the way you write?
I don't know if this is a direct answer, Scott, but something I have learned in working with I go into each of these titles as an outsider and not realizing the degree to which I'm an outsider. So 101 Things I Learned in Fashion School. Well, my sense of fashion is what I shop for and what I pick out of the closet, and does this tie go with this sport coat? That's the outsider's consumer's perspective. And it's always an eye-opener for me. We're not talking about what to wear. We're talking about how to design what people wear. And all of a sudden, I'm in the midst of something that I didn't realize I had signed up for. And that's true whether it's filmmaking, right? It's not about how to watch a film and enjoy it. It's no, how's it made? And wow, okay. So where I've throughout my life and my career, as I said, I've been a bit of a jack of all trades, and I'm interested in everything. But the biggest thing I think I've learned is that I'm still an outsider, and experts know their stuff in ways that we outsiders never will. And so I have a real respect, even though I had to maybe write more of these books, then I thought I will never be the expert in these topics.
Matt, give us some writing tips. I don't know anybody who doesn't now believe they are a content creator, whether you are a barber or a plumber, or you're a technician of some sort, whether you're a thought leader. Social media is exploding, I think, as it should be, of a marketplace of ideas and thought leadership. And so I think increasingly writing is an enormously valuable skill, especially to give a unique voice when ChatGPT and AI can basically do anything with some lack of soul, in my opinion. What are some key principles or tenets would you share with people to help people become better writers? Are there 4 or 5 lessons you've learned, whether you're a CEO writing a weekly blog on LinkedIn, maybe you are a designer that's trying to build your business with website content or whatever it is? Teach us some of the key principles that might unleash the creativity stuck inside of us if we could just get it to flow out of our head onto the paper, metaphorically.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm more inclined to answer that in terms of book writing. But one of the things that does come up early in that process of, if somebody wants to know, can I write a book? Is this a good enough idea for a book? Well, okay, it might be, but have you looked at it just being a blog or a blog post? Is it an essay? Is it something to publish on Medium? Or some other venue, or does it even want to be written? Is it something that would be better as a video or an animated short? But if we're in the book realm, I think that thing I run into all the time, it relates a little bit to what I said earlier, is that you have to step outside of your own work and be open to other ways of conceiving it. Because we all have great ideas for books, but it doesn't mean that it's going to land on the page in the way that the reader understands it. They might not even notice it in the bookstore. An example, I hope this person, if he recognizes himself, won't mind me using it for an example, but I coached someone a few years back on a golf book. And now, Scott, I don't know if you've played golf, but if you have, you know that it's brutal, right? There's so many things you have to know. Well, the thumb goes here and this hand goes there. And when you go back, you want to shift your weight. You have to turn, don't turn too much. Oh, wait, you're bending your arm, right? And one thing after another after another. And he had a lot of that in this book. And the title of the book was something like Play Better Golf Now. Well, okay, and now was italicized with 2 exclamation points. So right there, that tells me there's not a concept, because you're just trying to decorate with italics and exclamation points something that isn't there yet. And I talked to him at some length on the phone, and we get into the thumb and the straight arm and the weight shift. And it's just, you're writing a book and you're a very good golfer, but you're not a name anybody knows. And you're going to try to sell this next to books by Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus and the great teachers of golf. You're not going to get noticed. So let's think about how you as an outsider can get noticed. We're going to and actually, I'm sorry, before we got to that, we're mucking around. And I said, we can't just make this a book about everything. It's got to be about one thing or a couple of things. And he was getting, I won't say exasperated with me, because he was good natured, but he had reached the point in the conversation where he had to kind of grab me by the metaphorical shoulders and say, look, there's 4 ways that your swing can go wrong. All right. And he should, your ball can go left to right, right to left, and there's 2 reasons for each. And then there's the 4 things. And if you can fix that by doing what I recommend. There's your book. There's your book. 4 ways to suck at golf and 4 ways to be good at golf. And the cover, divided in 4 images, show the 4 swings, the path of flight. And then I'm the shopper in the bookstore, oh my gosh, that's my swing path. This book says how to suck at golf. Tiger Woods' book doesn't say that. So this guy's speaking to me. And you can imagine then, well, the book probably has 4 sections in it, or maybe it's 8 sections, right? Depending on how you interpret that. But you build the whole book out of that concept. So long story short is step outside your work, look at it from every angle, and find a true concept or idea that can drive the whole thing. It's very difficult to do that. You probably can't, most people can't do it themselves. You need a coach or somebody very critical to throw it back at you. And then you have to be willing to let go of a lot of what you've invested in.
Matt, I'm occasionally coaching authors that I represent on, the book that you may need to write may not be the book people want to read. You have to also write a book that people want to read, including how it's laid out and designed and architected. In many ways, you said the same. Do you believe that to be solid advice, that sometimes authors have to write a book more that people want to read than what it is they want to write?
Yes, we're creative animals, aren't we? So we think we have something to deliver to the world, and we see the writing process as pushing what we have inside here out onto the page, and we're brilliant and we're geniuses, and the world's going to notice. But what lands on the page it's only half of that picture. Again, it's what does the reader need to hear? Something I see in memoir or fiction, I don't typically coach fiction, but I sometimes do, is on page 1, the information dump, right? Dirk Billington walks into the room, a 6'4" figure, imposing, he's capable of everything, and he was born in here, and he's ready to take on the bad guys. And oh my gosh, no, we don't need to know Dirk Billington's last name. We might even need to know his first name. But the reader's not ready for that. They don't want the information dump. You're not giving them a test. Put them in the moment. Tell me the one thing there that you think needs to set the scene, and go from there. I don't know if that's a good example or not, but you have to know what the reader is ready for at any point. That applies to the book as a whole and to any one moment in your story or your prose.
Matt, you've authored 11 books in this series. Over what period of time?
Architecture School came out in 2007. So what is that, 17 years? That went quick.
And is it about every 18 months or so? What's your cadence? And is there any science to that? Or is it just kind of when it's done and you approve it, it's ready for release?
My contract with the publisher always has a date on it, and I don't meet them. I think I met them when I did the first 4 books with Hachette. I did meet my deadline for 4 books, and I think I was burned out for 2 years afterwards. So the process since then has been more, I signed a contract for 4 books. It has a date on, or 2 books, whatever it is. It has a delivery date, but the editors know that I have to sit and machinate for sometimes 2 or 3 years before the book is a book.
Again, as I've opened, I think you've done something that no one else has done, which in and of itself is cool and remarkable and inspiring. Do you find that your reader is the same for the entire series? Do you find that people that are interested in culinary buy culinary but don't buy fashion? To what extent have you learned as an author that people like me are buying them all just because I'm falling in love with the cadence, the design, the illustration, the insights, the applicability, the transfer? There's lots of things that I read in the product design book that are so applicable in my world, which is not product design. Do you have broad readers that just buy them all, or do you find that they're nuanced based on topic?
Well, I think this is where you're exceptional because you're not typical in that regard. I do run into people that collect the series, but more often it's, I think people buy 2 or 3 books, and they're typically related, like maybe business school and advertising school, right? Maybe the design books. We have, I don't know how many books now that are product design, architecture, urban design. So, or architecture and engineering, right? Depending on your approach, those 2 are related. So it tends more often, I think people find 2 or 3 that they like, but it is pretty cool when I run into somebody who has all of them or almost all of them.
Well, I am cool. The series is called The 101 Things I Learned. Your topics include advertising school, architecture school, culinary school, engineering, fashion, film, law, product design, urban design, business school. Have to end our conversation with what's next. Can you share with us what the next topics are on the horizon?
I suspect the next ones will be design related, although every so often something, landscape architecture, interior design, something like that. But every so often somebody proposes something that I hadn't thought of, stand-up comedy. There's no stand-up comedy school, but 101 things I learned in stand-up comedy, that could be a lot of fun and a nice break from the weightier stuff that some of the books dig into. I'm also writing 2 other books, which are very different. One is called Copernicus Goes to Suburbia. The other is called Radical Urbanism. And these are very heavy tomes, sociological in nature. It's interesting for me, at least, that Copernicus Goes to Suburbia grows out of some very basic lessons that are in the architecture book. You may recall there's some figure ground, like how to see shapes on a page and how to read the space that results from placing the shapes on the page. And over the centuries, we've actually largely lost the ability to see space. And when I've traced back that loss, I end up at the Copernican revolution. And my argument is that the Copernican revolution fundamentally changed how we see. And space became not this bounded thing as we used to understand the universe, but this infinite thing that goes obviously forever, and that this correlates to how we used to engage urban space versus infinite suburban space. So we changed the way we build today, unknowns to us, because of Mr. Copernicus 5 centuries ago. So that's pretty heavy stuff. So I'm trying to figure out how to balance that with more books in the series, and I'm also a practicing architect. So hard to say exactly what the next thing is. It's whatever the next phone call is, I guess, that comes in.
I find myself frequently contemplating the impact of the Copernican revolution. I'm kidding. I'm looking forward to that as well. It feels very Ryan Holiday-ish, and he's on fire right now. So anything you can write in the genre of Ryan Holiday and the Stoics and the intellects will be well received. How many books at a time in this series do you tend to work on? Do you tend to, have one land one, publish one, or do you have a variety of these types of topics going on simultaneously?
Typically at least 2 simultaneously. Yeah. And more often than not, there's 3 or 4 that are overlapping, but by a couple of years. So if a book takes 2 to 3 years, each one might overlap another by 6 months to a year and a half or something like that. Sometimes they line up, and I'm going from one meeting with one co-author to one with another. That actually is very helpful because I learned things about the process and what worked with one co-author by going to the other co-author. Hey, here's an idea that worked for Tracy on the advertising book. How about you try that out?
Matt Frederick, I can say I'm jealous of you in a very positive, healthy way. I think your books are absolute masterpieces. I hope that today's conversation exposes and turns on a whole new audience to your books because, again, like I said, independent of the topics, how you have illustrated them, laid them out, designed them is a way that I think is so helpful for a new genre of reader, even like myself, who reads several hundred books a year for this podcast and my own pleasure and professional development. I got a lot going on, and I need to consume the information in a way that is, a 2024 relevant style, and you have mastered that. Matthew Frederick, the producer and lead author of the 101 Things I Learned series. Thanks for joining us today.
Scott, it's been a great pleasure, and I hope you enjoy reading many more of them.
Well, I look forward to being a co-author on one of them. And we'll see you back next week for another conversation on leadership.